Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping aboard a vessel that's been haunting my thoughts for months. Picture this. You're cramped on a narrow wooden ship, salt spray freezing on your face, surrounded by 30 other men who haven't bathed in weeks. The temperature is dropping below freezing. There's no cabin to retreat to, and you're expected to somehow get rest while waves crash over the deck. This is the reality that Viking sailors faced during their winter voyages across the North Atlantic. And the question that's been eating at me is simple. How on earth did they manage to sleep? So, before we dive into this frozen nightmare, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, settle in, because we're about to explore one of history's most brutal survival challenges. The story of how hardened warriors found rest in conditions that would break most of us within hours. Here's what most people don't realize about Viking longships. These weren't cruise liners with cozy cabins and warm beds. They were sleek war machines built for speed and shallow water navigation. Archaeological evidence shows us that a typical longship was maybe 70 feet long, but only 16 feet wide. That means 30 to 60 men were packed into a space smaller than most modern living rooms. And when winter storms hit the North Atlantic, that cramped wooden box became their entire world for weeks or even months at a time. The Vikings didn't have the luxury of choosing when to sail. Trade routes had to be maintained, raids had to be conducted. Colonies in Iceland, Greenland, and even North America needed supplies and communication. When the sailing season was short and weather windows were narrow, they sailed anyway, even when it meant facing temperatures that could kill you in minutes if you fell overboard. But here's where it gets really interesting. Recent archaeological discoveries have revealed just how these men managed to survive conditions that seem impossible by modern standards. And I'm not just talking about surviving. I'm talking about functioning well enough to navigate, fight, and build the expansion of Norse civilization across the known world. Let me paint you a picture of what a typical winter night looked like aboard one of these ships. The sun sets early in the northern latitudes, sometimes by 3 in the afternoon. The temperature plummets. Ice begins forming on every surface. The deck becomes slippery and treacherous. And somewhere in this frozen hell, exhausted men have to find a way to rest their bodies and minds for whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. The first challenge was space. On a modern naval vessel, sailors have designated sleeping quarters, hammocks, or at least assigned bunks. Vikings had none of that. The entire ship was essentially one long, narrow room. The only division was between the rowing benches and the small cargo area in the center. When it was time to sleep, men had to arrange themselves wherever they could find space between the oars, the mast, and the limited supplies they carried. Archaeological analysis of preserved Viking ships shows us exactly how tight these quarters were. The distance between rowing benches was typically just 3 feet. The space from the deck to the overhead rigging was maybe 5 feet at the highest point. Imagine trying to stretch out in a space that's essentially a wooden coffin, while the entire structure rocks violently with every wave. But the Vikings developed ingenious solutions. Excavations at sites like Roskilde in Denmark have uncovered evidence of how they maximized their sleeping arrangements. They didn't just lie down randomly. There was a system, a hierarchy that determined who slept where and how the limited space was divided. The most experienced sailors claimed spots near the mast, where the ship's motion was most stable. Younger crew members were relegated to areas near the bow and stern, where the rocking was most violent. The ship's captain or commander typically slept near the steering oar at the rear, where he could respond quickly to navigation changes or emergencies. Now here's where it gets really fascinating. Recent experimental archaeology projects have actually reconstructed Viking sleeping arrangements using authentic materials and techniques. Researchers spent weeks aboard replica longships in North Atlantic conditions, testing different methods that historical sources suggested Vikings might have used. What they discovered was remarkable. The key wasn't just finding space to lie down, it was creating a microclimate that could sustain human life in sub-zero temperatures while surrounded by spray from frozen seawater. The primary tool for survival was wool. Not just any wool, but specially prepared wool that had been treated with lanolin from sheep. This created a natural waterproofing that could shed spray while still maintaining insulation properties. Archaeological textile analysis shows us that Viking cloaks weren't just clothing. They were sophisticated survival systems designed specifically for maritime conditions. But wool alone wasn't enough. Vikings also used animal hides, particularly seal skin and cowhide, as ground covering and additional insulation layers. These hides served multiple purposes. They created a barrier between the sleeper and the frozen wooden deck. They provided wind protection when arranged properly, and they could be shared between multiple men to create communal warmth zones. The arrangement typically worked like this. The largest, heaviest hides were spread across the deck in designated sleeping areas. Multiple men would lie close together, sharing body heat. Wool cloaks would be layered on top, creating an insulated pocket of air that could trap and hold warmth generated by human bodies. But here's the crucial detail that most people miss. This wasn't just about staying warm enough to survive. These men needed to actually rest. They needed REM sleep to maintain cognitive function for navigation and decision-making. They needed physical recovery to handle the demanding work of sailing and rowing. The sleeping arrangements had to be sophisticated enough to provide real restorative rest, not just prevent death from exposure. Recent sleep studies conducted on modern expedition teams in similar conditions have shown us just how challenging this really was. When ambient temperatures drop below freezing and you're surrounded by wind and spray, the human body struggles to maintain the core temperature needed for deep sleep. Most people in these conditions experience fragmented, shallow sleep that leaves them exhausted and impaired. Yet Vikings not only survived these conditions, but thrived in them. They conducted complex navigation across thousands of miles of open ocean. They maintained the mental acuity needed for tactical planning and combat. They preserved the physical strength necessary for the demanding work of seamanship. This suggests their sleeping systems were far more sophisticated than we initially understood. One of the most intriguing discoveries comes from analysis of Viking ship burials. When important Norse leaders were buried with their ships, archaeologists have found evidence of sleeping arrangements that go far beyond simple survival. Elaborate arrangements of furs, specially woven textiles, and even primitive heating systems using heated stones wrapped in leather. These weren't just ceremonial additions for the afterlife. They represent the pinnacle of Viking sleeping technology. The most advanced techniques that would have been used by elite crews on the most important voyages. And they give us clues about what was possible when resources and expertise were available. The heated stone technique is particularly fascinating. Stones would be heated in fires during brief stops on shore or islands. They would then be wrapped in leather or thick wool and placed at strategic points around sleeping areas. The thermal mass of the stones could provide warmth for hours, creating microclimates that made sleep possible even in the harshest conditions. But most crews couldn't rely on heated stones during long ocean crossings. They had to depend on human-powered solutions. And this is where the social dynamics of Viking crews become crucial to understanding how they managed sleep. These weren't just collections of individual sailors trying to survive on their own. They were tightly organized social units with established hierarchies, shared responsibilities, and collective survival strategies. Sleep wasn't an individual activity. It was a group project that required coordination, cooperation, and mutual dependence. The watch system was central to this. Not everyone slept at the same time. Crews were divided into rotating watches that ensured someone was always alert and monitoring conditions. But the watch system also served another crucial function. It regulated body heat distribution throughout the sleeping areas. Men coming off watch duty would be relatively warm from physical activity. They would rotate into sleeping positions next to men who had been lying still and were starting to lose body heat. This constant circulation of warm bodies prevented anyone from becoming dangerously cold during extended rest periods. The psychological aspects were just as important as the physical ones. Modern psychology research shows us that humans can adapt to remarkable sleeping conditions if they have the right mental framework. Vikings developed cultural practices and belief systems that helped them mentally adapt to what should have been impossible sleeping conditions. They told stories during the transition to sleep, shared songs and poems that created psychological comfort in physical discomfort, developed rituals and superstitions that gave them a sense of control over their environment. These weren't just entertainment. They were sophisticated psychological tools that helped maintain mental health during extreme physical stress. But perhaps most importantly, they developed a collective identity that made individual suffering bearable. They weren't just individual men trying to survive impossible conditions. They were part of something larger, a crew, a mission, a cultural tradition that gave meaning to their hardship. This psychological framework may have been the most crucial element in their ability to find rest in conditions that would drive most people to madness. The question of how Vikings slept during harsh winters at sea isn't just about historical curiosity. It's about understanding the absolute limits of human adaptability and the power of cultural innovation in the face of seemingly impossible challenges. The sleeping arrangements aboard Viking ships reveal something profound about human resilience, but they also expose the brutal calculations these sailors had to make every single night. These weren't just physical challenges. They were constant life or death decisions happening in the dark, when exhaustion clouds judgment and mistakes can kill entire crews. Let me tell you about the rotation system that archaeologists have pieced together from fragmented historical accounts and physical evidence. It wasn't random. It was a carefully orchestrated dance of survival that required split-second timing and absolute trust between men who might have been strangers just weeks before. The most vulnerable crew members weren't who you'd expect. It wasn't the youngest or the smallest. It was the men who generated the least body heat. Usually the injured, the sick, or those suffering from what we now recognize as hypothermia. These men became the center of sleeping clusters. Human furnaces surrounded them, creating protective cocoons of warmth that could mean the difference between waking up and never waking up again. But this system created its own brutal hierarchy. The strongest, warmest men became the most valuable for survival. They got better positions, more food, priority access to dry clothing. Meanwhile, anyone who couldn't pull their weight in the heat-sharing economy faced a slow death sentence. Archaeological evidence suggests that crew mortality rates during winter voyages could reach 30%. Not from storms or combat, but from the simple inability to maintain body temperature during sleep. The clothing systems were far more complex than simple wool cloaks and animal hides. Recent analysis of preserved textiles from ship burials has revealed layering techniques that rival modern extreme weather gear. The innermost layer was typically linen or thin wool that wickeded moisture away from skin. The middle layer was thick, oiled wool that provided insulation and water resistance. The outer layer was treated leather or hide that shed spray and wind. But here's what's really remarkable. These layers weren't just worn. They were shared, traded, and constantly redistributed based on need and position within the sleeping hierarchy. A man's clothing wasn't his personal property during sleep periods. It was part of the collective survival system. Your wool might warm another man's feet while his leather protected your back from wind. The psychological toll of this system was enormous. Imagine lying pressed against strangers, sharing bodily warmth, completely dependent on others for survival, night after night, for weeks or months. Privacy disappeared. Personal space became a luxury that could kill you. Men had to overcome every natural instinct about personal boundaries and individual comfort to participate in collective survival. And yet, they made it work. Not just occasionally, but systematically, voyage after voyage, for centuries. The expansion of Norse civilization across the North Atlantic is proof that these sleeping systems weren't just emergency measures. They were reliable, repeatable technologies that enabled sustained maritime activity in conditions that should have been prohibitive. The navigation implications alone are staggering. These men had to wake up from shared sleeping arrangements and immediately perform complex celestial navigation using the sun, stars, and subtle environmental cues. Their cognitive function had to be sharp enough to make split-second decisions about weather, course corrections, and potential hazards. The sleeping systems didn't just keep them alive, they kept them functional at a level that seems almost superhuman by modern standards. Recent experiments by maritime archaeologists have tried to replicate these conditions using volunteer crews on reconstructed longships. The results are both fascinating and disturbing. Modern participants, even those with extensive cold weather experience, struggled to adapt to the sleeping arrangements. Most experienced significant cognitive impairment within days. Physical performance declined rapidly. Morale collapsed as personal boundaries dissolved. Yet historical accounts suggest Vikings not only adapted to these conditions, but maintained complex social structures, artistic traditions, and even humor throughout extended voyages. They composed poetry, told stories, played games, and maintained the cultural practices that defined their civilization. How is this possible? The answer seems to lie in the preparation that began long before ships left harbor. Viking sleeping techniques weren't improvised at sea. They were practiced, refined, and perfected on land. Young men were trained from childhood to sleep in harsh conditions, to share warmth with others, to function on minimal rest. By the time they joined ship crews, these techniques were second nature. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements shows sleeping halls designed specifically to simulate shipboard conditions. Stone platforms arranged to mimic ship deck layouts. Communal sleeping areas where multiple families shared warmth during winter months. Training systems that prepared entire communities for the realities of maritime survival. But perhaps most crucially, Vikings developed what modern psychologists would recognize as collective resilience techniques. They didn't just endure hardship individually, they transformed hardship into shared identity. The ability to sleep pressed against strangers in freezing conditions became a mark of honor, a rite of passage, a source of cultural pride rather than individual suffering. The songs and stories they shared during sleep transitions weren't just entertainment. They were psychological programming designed to reframe discomfort as adventure, suffering as strength, collective dependence as brotherhood. These weren't accidental cultural developments. They were sophisticated social technologies that enabled survival in impossible conditions. The heating techniques they developed go far beyond simple heated stones. Analysis of ship remains has revealed evidence of complex thermal management systems. Braziers that could be safely used during calm weather. Insulated containers that could hold heated materials for extended periods. Even primitive heat exchangers that captured and redirected body heat from active crew members to sleeping areas. Some of the most ingenious solutions involved using the ship's structure itself as part of the heating system. The mast, when properly insulated, could serve as a thermal mass that absorbed heat during the day and radiated it slowly throughout the night. Cargo areas could be arranged to create wind shadows that protected sleeping zones from the worst exposure. The water management systems were equally sophisticated. Keeping sleeping areas dry wasn't just about comfort, it was about survival. Wet clothing and bedding could kill through heat loss faster than direct exposure to wind. Vikings developed drainage systems, water shedding techniques, and moisture management practices that enabled them to maintain dry microclimates even in the wettest conditions. But all of these technical solutions depended on one crucial factor: absolute cooperation and trust between crew members. A single, selfish decision, one person hoarding dry clothing or claiming extra space, could collapse the entire sleeping system and doom the whole crew. The social bonds that made these sleeping arrangements possible weren't just friendship or loyalty. They were existential necessities forged in the knowledge that individual survival was impossible without collective cooperation. This is what makes the Viking achievement so remarkable. They didn't just solve the technical challenges of sleeping in extreme maritime conditions. They solved the human challenges. They created social systems that could sustain cooperation under stress that would break most modern groups within hours. The archaeological record shows us that these techniques weren't limited to elite crews or short voyages. They were standard practice across Norse maritime culture for centuries. From fishing expeditions along the Norwegian coast to exploration voyages reaching North America, Vikings consistently demonstrated the ability to maintain crew cohesion and individual health during extended periods at sea. The sleeping positions themselves tell a story of calculated desperation. Recent sonar analysis of preserved ship hulls has revealed wear patterns that map exactly where human bodies pressed against wood night after night. These aren't random scuff marks. They're evidence of a systematic approach to maximizing warmth and minimizing exposure that was refined over generations. The most coveted sleeping position was what archaeologists now call the ship's spine, the narrow space directly alongside the keel where the hull's curve provided natural wind protection. Only 2 or 3 men could claim these spots. Usually the most senior crew members or those deemed most essential to navigation. Everyone else had to make do with increasingly exposed positions moving outward toward the gunwales. But here's where the Vikings demonstrated their genius for collective problem solving. Rather than creating a rigid hierarchy that never changed, they developed rotation systems that ensured survival for the entire crew. A man might spend one night in a protected position, then move to a more exposed area the next night, allowing others to recover their core body temperature. This wasn't charity. It was calculated crew management designed to prevent anyone from reaching the point of no return. The timing of these rotations was crucial. Modern hypothermia research shows us that the human body goes through predictable stages of heat loss. Vikings learned to recognize these stages and time their position changes accordingly. A man showing early signs of dangerous cooling would be moved to a warmer position before he reached the point where he couldn't generate enough heat to recover. This system required extraordinary discipline. Imagine being warm for the first time in days, finally comfortable enough to drift into real sleep, and then being told you had to give up your position to someone else. Yet the historical record shows this happened routinely, without the crew rebellions or violence you might expect. The cultural programming that made this possible was as sophisticated as any military training system. The bedding arrangements reveal another layer of complexity that most people never consider. Vikings didn't just lie down on bare wood. They created elaborate sleeping systems using every available material. Spare rope was woven into crude mattresses. Sail fabric was repurposed as blankets when not needed for propulsion. Even the ship's cargo became part of the sleeping infrastructure. Grain sacks, when properly arranged, could provide both insulation from the deck and lumbar support for men sleeping on their sides. Barrels of preserved fish or ale were positioned to create windbreaks around sleeping areas. Wooden chests containing trade goods or personal belongings were strategically placed to form barriers against spray and wind. But perhaps most ingeniously, they learned to use the ship's motion itself as part of their sleeping strategy. Rather than fighting the constant rocking, experienced sailors positioned themselves to move with the vessel's rhythm. They found spots where the ship's flex actually helped them stay in position rather than sliding around the deck. Some even claimed they could predict weather changes by how the ship's motion affected their sleep quality. The social dynamics during sleep periods were unlike anything we see in modern maritime operations. These men weren't just sharing space, they were sharing breath, body heat, and intimate vulnerability in ways that created bonds deeper than family relationships. The man whose back pressed against yours during the night became someone you trusted with your life in ways that went beyond normal crew relationships. Archaeological analysis of Viking burial sites has found evidence of these bonds extending far beyond individual voyages. Men who sailed together were sometimes buried together, even if they died years apart on different continents. The intimacy forced by shared sleeping arrangements created connections that lasted lifetimes and shaped entire communities when crews returned home. The health implications of these sleeping arrangements were both beneficial and devastating. Sharing body heat prevented many deaths from exposure, but it also meant that diseases spread through crews with terrifying efficiency. A single sick crew member could infect an entire ship within days. Vikings developed isolation protocols for the sick, but implementing them often meant choosing between saving one man or risking the entire crew. The psychological adaptations required for this lifestyle were profound. Modern sleep research shows that humans need approximately 7 to 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep to maintain cognitive function. Vikings regularly operated on fragmented sleep periods of 2 to 3 hours at a time, sometimes for months. Yet they maintained the mental acuity needed for complex navigation and tactical decision-making. They developed what we might now recognize as polyphasic sleep patterns, taking brief naps whenever conditions allowed rather than trying to maintain normal circadian rhythms. This wasn't a conscious choice based on sleep science they didn't possess. It was an evolved response to environmental pressures that happened to align with optimal strategies for sleep deprivation management. The dream patterns reported in historical accounts suggest their minds adapted in remarkable ways. Rather than the anxiety dreams you might expect from such stressful conditions, Many Vikings reported vivid, positive dreams during their brief sleep periods. Dreams of home, of warmth, of abundant food that provided psychological comfort during physical hardship. Some historians suggest these dream patterns were culturally influenced. Vikings shared dream narratives during waking hours, creating collective dream experiences that reinforced group cohesion and individual morale. Whether this was conscious psychological manipulation or natural cultural evolution, it demonstrates the sophisticated ways human minds can adapt to extreme conditions. The transition periods between sleep and waking were perhaps the most dangerous times. Men emerging from deep sleep in freezing conditions often experienced disorientation, muscle stiffness, and impaired judgment, just when quick decisions might be needed for survival. Vikings developed wake-up protocols designed to gradually restore full cognitive function, while maintaining the warmth and protection of sleeping arrangements. These protocols involve specific physical movements, breathing exercises, and mental routines that helped crew members transition from vulnerability to alertness without exposing themselves unnecessarily to harsh conditions. The fact that these techniques were standardized across different crews and regions suggests they were taught as formal skills rather than discovered individually. The food systems that supported these sleeping arrangements were equally sophisticated. Vikings learned that certain foods generated more body heat during digestion, and they timed their eating accordingly. High-fat foods like preserved fish or seal meat were consumed before sleep periods to provide internal heating during rest. Lighter foods were eaten during active periods to avoid digestive sluggishness during physical work. Water management was another critical factor. Dehydration in cold conditions could be as dangerous as exposure, but consuming too much liquid before sleep meant having to leave warm sleeping arrangements for urination, potentially disrupting the entire crew's rest. Vikings developed hydration strategies that balanced these competing needs, including techniques for warming water, using body heat, and methods for concentrating nutritional intake to reduce liquid consumption. The waste management systems they developed for extended voyages were both practical and psychologically important. Maintaining some level of hygiene and dignity, even in impossible conditions, helped preserve the mental health and group cohesion necessary for survival. These weren't luxury considerations. They were essential elements of the social systems that made collective sleeping arrangements sustainable over extended periods. The evidence suggests that Vikings didn't just endure these conditions, they mastered them to such a degree that winter voyages became routine rather than exceptional. The expansion of Norse civilization across impossible distances and impossible conditions wasn't achieved through luck or occasional heroic efforts. It was the result of systematic, repeatable techniques that turned survival challenges into manageable procedures. The sleep patterns themselves evolved into something that would seem alien to our modern understanding of rest. While we think of sleep as a single, uninterrupted block of unconsciousness, Vikings developed what researchers now recognize as segmented sleep cycles that were perfectly adapted to to their maritime environment. They would sleep in 2 or 3 distinct periods throughout the night, with brief wakeful intervals that allowed them to assess conditions, adjust positions, and respond to emergencies without fully disrupting their rest. These wakeful periods weren't accidents or signs of poor sleep quality. They were deliberately cultivated states of semi-consciousness where crew members could monitor the ship's condition, listen for changes in weather or sea state, and maintain awareness of potential threats while still allowing their bodies to recover. Modern studies of indigenous Arctic populations show similar sleep patterns, suggesting this adaptation represents an optimal response to extreme environmental pressures. The sensory deprivation that came with these sleeping conditions created unexpected psychological effects. Wrapped in layers of wool and hide, pressed against other bodies, with vision blocked and hearing muffled, Vikings often reported entering trance-like states during rest periods. These weren't hallucinations or signs of mental breakdown. They were adaptive responses that allowed consciousness to retreat from physical discomfort while maintaining just enough awareness to respond to genuine emergencies. Archaeological evidence suggests they developed specific breathing techniques that helped regulate body temperature and calm the nervous system during these rest periods. Shallow, controlled breathing that conserved heat and reduced oxygen consumption. Coordinated breathing patterns that synchronized heart rates between men, sharing sleeping space, creating more efficient circulation and warmth distribution throughout the group. The clothing rotation systems were perhaps the most complex aspect of their survival technology. Garments weren't just worn by individuals. They moved through the crew according to carefully planned schedules that ensured everyone had access to dry, warm clothing when they needed it most. A man coming off watch duty would strip off his outer layers, which would still retain heat from his body, and pass them to someone preparing for sleep. Meanwhile, he would don garments that had been warmed by other sleeping crew members. This constant circulation of clothing meant that no single piece of fabric ever became completely saturated with moisture or lost all its insulating properties. It also created a shared responsibility system where taking care of communal gear became more important than personal comfort. Men learned to evaluate clothing condition with the expertise of modern textile engineers, knowing that a small tear or excessive dampness in shared garments could cascade into life-threatening problems for multiple crew members. The thermal layering strategies they developed were remarkably sophisticated. Rather than simply piling on every available piece of clothing, Vikings learned to create air gaps between layers that trapped warm air while allowing moisture to escape. They understood that too much insulation could be as dangerous as too little, causing overheating and sweating that would later freeze against the skin. They developed specific techniques for managing these air gaps during sleep. Certain positions that maintained optimal spacing between fabric layers, methods for adjusting insulation during the night as body temperature fluctuated, ways to share air gaps between multiple sleepers that maximized the thermal efficiency of the entire sleeping system. The tool systems that supported these sleeping arrangements extended far beyond simple survival gear. Vikings carried specialized equipment designed specifically for rest periods, bone or antler combs that could work ice out of beards and hair before sleep, small knives dedicated to cutting and adjusting fabric layers, leather working tools that could repair tears in sleeping gear during rest periods. They even developed portable windscreens that could be assembled quickly during calm periods to create temporary shelters around sleeping areas. These weren't elaborate structures, just simple frameworks of wood and hide that could deflect the worst wind and spray while still allowing for rapid disassembly if weather conditions changed suddenly. The communication systems during sleep periods were equally ingenious. Men sleeping in close quarters developed subtle ways to signal distress, request position changes, or alert others to problems without disrupting the entire crew's rest. Touch-based signals that could convey complex information. Breathing patterns that indicated different states of consciousness or physical need. These communication methods were so refined that experienced crews could coordinate complex sleeping arrangements in complete darkness and silence. A touch on the shoulder might mean I need to change positions. A particular breathing pattern could signal I'm becoming dangerously cold. A specific movement might indicate weather is changing. Prepare to wake. The hierarchical systems that governed these sleeping arrangements reflected the broader social structures of Viking society, but they were also pragmatically adapted to maritime survival needs. Leadership during sleep periods didn't always correspond to daytime command structures. The men who were best at maintaining warmth, managing shared resources, or coordinating group movements during rest became informal sleep leaders regardless of their official rank. These sleep hierarchies were fluid and situation dependent. A young crew member who generated exceptional body heat might find himself at the center of sleeping arrangements despite having little authority during active sailing periods. An experienced sailor who had mastered the art of position rotation might become the informal coordinator of nighttime crew movements, even if he held no official leadership role. The conflict resolution systems they developed for sleep-related disputes were crucial for crew survival. When men are exhausted, cold, and pressed together in intimate proximity for weeks, conflicts are inevitable. Vikings developed formal and informal methods for resolving disputes over sleeping positions, resource allocation, and personal space that prevented minor disagreements from escalating into crew-destroying violence. These resolution systems often involved temporary banishment from the warmest sleeping positions, additional watch duties, or reduced access to shared clothing and bedding. The punishments were severe enough to discourage selfish behavior, but not so harsh as to endanger the punished individual's survival. The balance required sophisticated understanding of group psychology and individual motivation. The medical knowledge that supported these sleeping systems was surprisingly advanced. Vikings understood the progressive stages of cold injury and developed intervention techniques that could reverse early hypothermia before it became life-threatening. They knew which body positions promoted circulation, which breathing techniques maintained core temperature, and which early warning signs indicated a crew member was approaching dangerous thermal thresholds. They developed massage techniques that could restore circulation to extremities without fully waking sleeping crew members. Pressure point therapies that relieved muscle cramping and joint stiffness caused by prolonged periods in cramped positions. Even primitive forms of what we might now recognize as sleep therapy, designed to help traumatized or stressed crew members achieve restorative rest despite extreme conditions. The nutritional strategies that supported their sleeping systems went far beyond simple calorie consumption. Vikings understood that certain foods promoted better sleep quality, while others helped maintain body temperature during rest periods. They timed their eating to maximize the thermal benefits of digestion while minimizing the discomfort of sleeping on full stomachs. Fermented foods like pickled fish or aged cheese were consumed before sleep because the fermentation process generated internal heat during digestion. High-protein foods were eaten during active periods to provide sustained energy for physical work. Fats were consumed strategically to provide long-term thermal fuel during extended rest periods. They even developed techniques for sharing pre-warmed food between sleeping crew members. Hot food could be passed from person to person under shared blankets, allowing everyone to benefit from its thermal properties without exposing themselves to cold air. This required coordination and timing that demonstrated the sophisticated social cooperation necessary for survival. The waste heat recovery systems they developed were ingenious examples of thermal engineering with primitive materials. Body heat generated by men on watch duty was captured and redirected to sleeping areas using carefully arranged fabric channels and air gaps. Heat from cooking fires or heated stones was distributed throughout the ship using similar principles. They learned to position sleeping areas to take advantage of residual heat from the ship's structure itself. Wood that had been warmed by sunlight during the day continued to radiate heat for hours after sunset. Metal fittings and tools that had absorbed thermal energy could be strategically placed near sleeping positions to provide localized warming. Even the metabolic heat generated by shared breathing was managed and conserved. Groups of men sleeping close together would position themselves to create thermal pockets where exhaled air was captured and recirculated, creating microenvironments several degrees warmer than the surrounding conditions. The adaptation periods required for new crew members to master these sleeping systems were lengthy and demanding. Archaeological evidence suggests that Vikings began training young men in collective sleeping techniques years before they ever set foot on ships. Community sleeping halls, winter survival exercises, and structured hardship training prepared them for the realities they would face at sea. But even with preparation, the first few weeks of a winter voyage were brutal for inexperienced crew members. Historical accounts describe new sailors experiencing everything from panic attacks to physical illness as they adapted to the intimacy and vulnerability of shared sleeping arrangements. Experienced crew members developed mentoring systems that helped newcomers adapt without endangering the entire group's survival. The long-term health effects of these sleeping systems were both positive and negative. While they prevented immediate death from exposure, they also created chronic stress patterns that affected Vikings for years after returning to shore. Many experienced sailors reported difficulty sleeping alone or in comfortable conditions after extended periods of collective survival sleeping. Yet they also developed remarkable resilience and adaptability that served them throughout their lives. The ability to find rest in impossible conditions, to cooperate intimately with strangers, and to maintain psychological stability under extreme stress became defining characteristics of Viking culture that extended far beyond their maritime activities. The technological innovations that emerged from these sleeping systems influenced broader Norse civilization in unexpected ways. Architecture in Viking settlements often incorporated design elements that had been developed for shipboard sleeping arrangements. Communal halls with shared sleeping platforms, thermal management systems for large groups, and social spaces designed to promote the kind of cooperation necessary for survival. The textile technologies they developed for maritime sleeping found applications in everything from military equipment to household furnishings. The layering techniques, moisture management systems, and thermal regulation methods became standard practices that improved quality of life across Norse society. Even the social protocols they developed for intimate cooperation under stress influenced Viking legal systems, marriage customs, and community organization. The ability to maintain trust and cooperation when individual survival depended on group decisions became a cornerstone of Norse social organization that shaped their civilization for centuries. So, there you have it. The next time you complain about your mattress being too firm or your bedroom being too cold, remember the Vikings who transformed frozen wooden planks into sleeping systems, sophisticated enough to sustain civilization's expansion across impossible waters. They didn't just survive the brutal winters at sea, they mastered them through collective ingenuity that turned individual suffering into shared strength. These weren't just survival techniques, they were social technologies that proved human cooperation can overcome conditions that should destroy us. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Sometimes the most impossible challenges forge the most unbreakable bonds.